Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is Disaster Resilience, Equity, and the Next 4 Years of FEMA, What Lawyers Should Know. And our program today is sponsored by the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. Next slide, please. My name is Jeannie Ortiz, and I am the co-vice director of the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services Program, or DLS, which operates under the ABA's Young Lawyers Division. And I am very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Stephanie Duke, who is a staff attorney and alumni Equal Justice Works Disaster Resilience Fellow at Disability Rights Texas. Amanda Poland, who is a program specialist with the Individuals and Households Program at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. And Jonathan Reynolds, who is an heirs property staff attorney at Louisiana Appleseed. We also have our programs director, Linda Anderson Stanley, joining us today, and she's monitoring the chat for any questions you may have or resources that we can share with you. Next slide. For those of you not familiar, and we can move on to the next slide. With the ABA DLS program, we are a group of volunteer attorneys across the country that works to operationalize a memorandum of agreement with FEMA to provide free legal services to individuals who have been impacted by a major natural disaster. The DLS program is part of FEMA's Individual Assistance Program, which operates under the Robert Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. It's been managed by the ABA for nearly 50 years, and we do our work in partnership, if we can move on to the next slide, in partnership with multiple nonprofit legal service providers, partnership-based organizations, federal and state emergency responders, bar associations, and other groups in the impacted area to assist survivors with legal issues arising out of the disaster. And if you're interested in learning more about the DLS program and how it has operated in your state or how it can improve, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions after the webinar. Next slide. We organized today's program in honor of Disaster Resilience Awareness Month, which is an effort that happens every March and led by Equal Justice Works, the DLS program, and other national organizations responding to disasters. And during this month, we encourage organizations to share resources on disaster preparedness and recovery for both survivors and members of the legal community. And during the month, or this month, is also an invitation to others in the legal community to recognize the importance of preparing to address the legal needs of survivors, learning from past disaster responses, so that our communities can quickly adapt to weather events and recover from them and from their impact. Next slide. And part of this work includes developing an understanding of the current landscape of legal needs and solutions, right? And how, as lawyers, we can help our clients navigate recovery. So to that end, I encourage attendees joining us today to join as well the National Disaster Attorney Guidebook webinar program on March 30, which is also happening as part of the Disaster Resilience Awareness Month effort, and where speakers will walk you through what the guidebook is and how to use it. This is a new resource, and I think a really great opportunity for new folks in this area, but also those who have experience in disaster recovery to learn more about the issues that we see. And we can drop that link in the chat as well. Next slide. And the next slide. Just a few more things before we begin. This program is being recorded, and you will be able to download the materials and a link to the recording on the same page where you registered. And thanks so much to registrants who submitted questions in advance of the program. We have shared your questions with our speakers today, and we will do our best to address all of them, but still encourage you to enter questions in the Q&A function of your screen, and we will have some time at the end to answer those questions. Next slide. And we recognize that 1 hour is certainly not enough to cover everything related to disaster legal response or questions that you may have. So we have listed here a few national resources that we think are really comprehensive and that we may mention throughout the webinar as well. Next slide. For today's program, as you may have seen on the registration page, we'll be focusing on FEMA's strategic plan for the next 4 years and what that means for disaster survivors. The link to the strategic plan is across the materials, but we can share that via the chat as well in a moment. And I'll be providing some context around the topic for the next few minutes and then turning it over to Stephanie, Jonathan, and Amanda. All right, next slide. And next slide as well. Here's a snapshot of weather and climate disasters just from last year. This visual is provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And as you can see, there were a lot of disasters all over the country in just 1 year, with over 50 major disaster declarations made by the president and those responses administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. These disasters last year took the lives of almost 700 people across the country, and damages totaled close to $145 billion, with Hurricane Ida and the Western wildfires among the costliest of those disasters. Next slide. And what this means is that many individuals and communities had to navigate recovery to obtain assistance from federal and/or state recovery programs, address repair issues with landlords, which is a common issue that we see in the aftermath of disasters, or things such as replacing legal and identification documents lost or destroyed during the disaster. We've included here, it's sort of a snapshot of the common legal needs over the length of recovery. Next slide. And we also know that when it comes to disaster recovery, there's an imbalance, right? With minority groups, people with Hispanic or Latino backgrounds, Black disaster survivors and families, people with limited wealth, who are less likely to recover the same way as their white counterparts. And these disparities, which we've summarized over the next 2 slides, have been well documented in the past, especially after major disasters. And one of the focus areas today will be an important change that FEMA made around alternative ways to prove ownership and occupancy, which has historically been an obstacle for survivors to gain access to recovery programs in places in the South, such as Louisiana, Alabama, North Carolina, and other places like Puerto Rico. Next slide. We also know that when we talk about equitable disaster responses, we should be thinking about those who are overlooked or left behind in the wake of a disaster, right? Such as people whose first language is not English, and people with disabilities who often face barriers everywhere from warnings about the disaster to their experiences at a disaster recovery center, to applying for recovery programs, and even throughout the process of seeking free legal assistance. Next slide. So last year, just to provide a little bit more context, the president issued an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And that the order essentially orders all heads of federal agencies, and I'll read from a quote here, to assess whether and to what extent its programs and policies perpetuate systemic barriers to opportunities and benefits for people of color and other underserved groups. Such assessments will better equip agencies to develop policies and programs that deliver resources and benefits equitably to all. The executive order also established an interagency working group on equitable data to identify inadequacies in 16 federal data collection programs, and also to refine the data available to the federal government to measure equity based on key demographics such as race, ethnicity, gender, and disability. And as a result of that executive order, FEMA implemented several changes to its programs, which are outlined on the agency's strategic plan for 2022 to 2026, and which is the basis for our presentation and discussion today. We will be focusing on goal number 1, which is to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management, but certainly encourage everyone to review the rest of the plan, which we've dropped the link in the chat for, which can also help inform your efforts and work around disaster recovery. Next slide. So I'm going to ask our panelists today to please share more about their experiences in this type of work, what things the legal community should keep in mind and what we can do to support disaster survivors as they recover. Next slide. Stephanie, I know I shared a few questions with you and you answered all of them, which is great. And you've been a disability rights advocate for several years now, right? So if you can please share with our audience the challenges and specific examples that you can share about people with disabilities navigating recovery and what solutions exist to address those challenges, and also what, if anything, is still needed. And finally, we also received some questions from registrants if you think you can address those questions as part of your remarks, specifically, number 1, how recent changes by FEMA has impacted the disability community, and if you have seen a difference in the changes taking effect, whether that's through FEMA applications or appeals, and number 2, or other areas. And number 2, if you have any suggestions for getting survivors with disabilities to recognize the importance of registering for FEMA. And I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie. All right, let's talk about disability inclusion and disaster response. So what rights do survivors have with disabilities, or should they have, right? And even potential disaster survivors with disabilities have rights to participate in and benefit from federal, state, and local programs involved in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery as everyone else. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and American with Disabilities Act Title II are going to be your legal protections that cover entities depending on how they're funded and who's operating programs. But discriminatory barriers and outcomes in disaster response and recovery exist because individuals with disabilities are denied meaningful access. Meaningful access necessitates that covered entities take reasonable steps for inclusive procedures and policies and mechanisms to afford reasonable accommodations when applicable. A reasonable accommodation could be an aid, support, service, and a modification to a current procedure or policy, that of which is required for that individual based on their need to afford an equitable opportunity or meaningful access to participate in and benefit from programs and services. For example, reasonable accommodations for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing will look different for a reasonable accommodation for someone who's blind or has a visual impairment, or someone with a mobility impairment. So that reasonable accommodation process allows an individual to access and benefit from those programs and services they're trying to get to. So then, next slide, the problems and challenges. What are the common disability-related issues in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery? First one is lack of inclusive preparedness at local levels and lack of guidance or training for inclusive planning or preparedness from state and federal levels. The second one is a lack of public-facing transparent processes for disaster survivors with disabilities to understand what they might be afforded through the reasonable accommodation process. And then lack of minimal engagement of the disability community or stakeholders in developing these inclusive processes. So unfortunately, the impact of not having these things established is that the disability community continues to be disproportionately impacted by events and unlawfully denied services. When thinking about a reasonable accommodation, unfortunately, at this point, FEMA doesn't have a standard practice yet. That is something they're working on, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But if you're a disaster survivor applying to FEMA's individual housing program, one of the variables that they look at is the habitability of a residence. Unfortunately, disaster survivors do not know they can request a modification to that habitability standard if they in fact have an autoimmune deficiency that puts them at risk for living in disaster environmental hazards, such as mold or smoke damage, that someone else may be able to live with when they can't. So it's this lack of public facing and transparent process that denies these survivors an opportunity to participate in and benefit from those programs. In the context of response and recovery, FEMA provides guidance, but that falls to the obligation of state and local governments. And without an inclusive process, reasonably and practically, you're not going to have ad hoc accommodations in an event because it's chaotic. It's, there's all kinds of things going on. So that inclusive process and bringing the right people to the table to discuss how you're going to ensure these equitable outcomes has to be done in blue sky or steady state times. So that's why it's so important to have this inclusiveness beforehand to provide those things at the end. And I kind of jumped up to the next slide. So solutions, next slide. What changes have happened or need to happen at the federal level to ensure disability inclusion and disaster response? So Jeannie mentioned Biden's Executive Order 13985, which talks about racial equity and also supporting underserved communities. And FEMA has provided some initiatives, and there's actually some more information coming out on how to collect data to evaluate, disaggregate, and assess the disparities to hopefully change more policies and programs in the future. But FEMA's also updated its IAPPG, Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, last fall, which does have some positive impacts for the disability community. One being a quicker response for crisis counseling program just means that program can roll out quicker after an event and when an IA declaration requests that and is approved. And of course that supports disaster behavioral health. Occupancy residency documentation, which Jonathan is going to address in more detail, obviously impacts the disability community well for positive. Updates for residents for non-traditional housing. If occupancy can be verified, now allows for potential rental assistance when it didn't previously. Clean and removal assistance for flood events has also been expanded if you have been deemed eligible. And then accessibility, real property items available for disaster caused disability, meaning if something happened in the event itself and you now have an impairment and didn't have an accessibility items in your residence, now FEMA would provide those things. And then of course the strategic plan, which Amanda will address, also has some other equity initiatives into it. But still needed is that FEMA must implement a public facing, transparent, reasonable accommodation process with an overarching coordination among all programs, right? Provide training and adequate supervision for FEMA employees to engage in this interactive process to ensure all disaster survivors with disabilities or are afforded an equitable opportunity to participate in and benefit from all of FEMA's programs. From the application itself to the registration intake process, to housing inspections, to working towards a permanent housing plan and direct housing assistance, there's all kinds of things that need to afford reasonable accommodations and looking at the disaster survivors' needs and figuring out how to make it equitable for them. Aside from that, again, FEMA doesn't have the control over necessarily of state and local governments, but can provide guidance on how to facilitate and promote the collaboration between the public and private sectors and utilization of nonprofits, the community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, or other volunteer organizations to support emergency management in preparedness and response and recovery activities for efforts to support our vulnerable communities. Next slide. What has Disability Rights Texas done to address the issues I've mentioned? From a direct service aspect, we've asserted reasonable accommodation requests in actionable cases for clients, are educated and informed other legal aid providers, provided technical assistance on the law and best practices. Sometimes you have to think outside the box. It may not be an obvious reasonable accommodation that you may need. So just collaborating with other legal aid providers to ensure that those needs are addressed. From an advocacy aspect, educating and informing governmental entities that barriers continue to exist and reiterate they have non-discriminatory obligations by submitting comments on rules and regulations that apply to disaster response and recovery, providing testimony, supporting research, and most importantly, gaining a seat at the table with stakeholders and planners to facilitate that whole community planning process in blue sky or steady state times. So the next piece, what attorneys can do, or advocates, to ensure clients' rights are protected. One, the most important thing is to understand what your client needs, not what you think they want, but understand that the functional limitations that a disability may create, and be able to identify that reasonable accommodation that would provide them meaningful access to whatever program and services they're trying to benefit from. What should survivors with disability needs know about their rights and how to enforce them? So first thing is, requiring an aid, support, or service or modification does not exclude you or eliminate your right to access a program and services. That's an obligation that should be afforded to you to provide that meaningful access. So ask questions to the right people over and over until your needs are addressed. Unfortunately, that's kind of the way the system works, right? So one to two things I've learned about advocacy for disability rights. For sure, I can say with 100% certainty that an equitable response and recovery is contingent on inclusive practices. Like I said before, especially in response and recovery, making ad hoc accommodations after a disaster isn't real. So that's why it's so imperative to have the inclusive practices beforehand, having those conversations, figuring out what the gaps are and how we fill them, ingraining that inclusivity into blue sky or steady state preparedness procedures and whoever's involved, and these mechanisms which implement the response and recovery activities until that automaticity happens and the operable outcomes sustain all the community lifelines we need for the entire community. That's what affords equitable outcomes. We can never be 100% prepared for any one event, but we can and must do a better job as a collective to mitigate the harm for our most vulnerable populations. And, you know, the disaster doesn't discriminate, right? The event itself does not care where you live. Obviously, an event may hit geographically, but it doesn't care what car you drive. If you have a car, how many zeros you have in your bank account. The event doesn't discriminate. It's the things that we have in place that do that we need to take a closer look at, having these conversations with the right people to figure out how to move forward and provide equitable response and recovery.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. I think that was a really good list of practical tips and a summary of what you've learned over the past few years. And thanks for mentioning the IAPPG, which I know Linda has shared via the chat as well, for those of you who would like access to that guide. All right, so Jonathan, you have experience in heirs property issues in Louisiana. And as we mentioned earlier in the program, since August of last year, FEMA is now accepting alternate proof of documentation for ownership and occupancy of a damaged home. And we know that that was a big issue after Hurricane Katrina. So it would be great if you could please provide additional context about this problem in the aftermath of major disasters and address questions that we received from registrants, specifically what your experience has been with this change as you compare survivors receiving assistance from Hurricane Katrina after 2005 and survivors receiving assistance after Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana last year. And then finally, there's also a question on advice you can provide on locating heirs for service when a client has no knowledge of their location or names. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I can help with all those things. Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Reynolds. So the first question is what is heirs property? Heirs property comes about when one of your relatives dies or the person's relatives dies and the property is inherited, but the necessary legal steps aren't taken to actually change the name of the title with the municipality to that of the current owner. And with these things, a lot of problems can come about. The first thing is there's the idea of the property becomes unmarketable. And what unmarketable means is there are all these other dilemmas that come with this property. Can we have the next slide, please? And so, oh, that doesn't look right. And so with the dilemmas, one of the biggest dilemmas, the one we're talking about today is folks are locked out of recovery funds after a disaster. During Hurricane Katrina, over 2,000 people could not access recovery funds due to having some sort of clouded title, due to having unclear ownership. And the way that, and then also they're not capable of receiving state disaster funds, insurance funds. The insurance company wants to know whose name is on this property. You look at the title with the city, it says the name of the deceased person as opposed to the person actually filing the insurance claim. Negotiating with banks, trying to get bank loans to repair the property, same issue. Even to the point where once you receive your funds and it comes time to repair the property, now you have to speak with all the other heirs who own the property and have an agreement on what can be done with the property. So it's a very unstable form of property ownership. And it leads to a lot of land loss. Next slide, please. So what the first thing that's going to happen when people apply for assistance, disaster assistance, they're going to have to prove their ownership. And the first step in proving ownership is the actual tax records, the assessor records. And the person who's going through to on FEMA side to actually clear it is going to look at the assessor records and they're going to see, does this name match the applicant's name? In a manner, when we're dealing with heirs property, it won't. When we're dealing with heirs property, it might say the person's parent's name. It might say the person's grandparent's name. In some cases, it might even say a person who died 50 or 60 years ago's name on the actual tax title. And so now we're into the situation of how do we have to clear this up? How does this person prove ownership? And so the actual process of clearing title can take a very long time and it can be very expensive. So when I say that it can take a very long time, part of clearing title is drawing a direct link between the applicant and the person whose name is on the assessor data. And sometimes this could be 60, 70 years apart. This could be a person who died 70 years ago. This could be 5 or 6 generations worth of people between the registered owner and the actual physical owner who's the applicant right now. And I would say that, like, even with an experienced, knowledgeable title examiner who's used to dealing with heirs property, this could take, weeks. This could take days, even on a very easy one, but on one where it's like a 70-year gap, it could take weeks. And these title examiners are very expensive. They can cost like between $200 and $500 a day. And what's happening now is FEMA realized that it's impractical to have folks have to go through all this stuff before they can get to their aid and then actually be able to repair their property. But there are things that we could do as lawyers when we are in these situations where we are trying to unbundle these things. The first thing is you want to actually have the family members, to their best, try to make a family tree. And then we can also rebuild this family tree, fill it in, and form it through the title records and running the title back. So one of the questions that someone asked is, how do we go about finding these missing heirs? The first thing is identifying that there are missing heirs. And that's going to come through the family tree and reinforming the family tree through a use of combination of title records, census records, newspaper records. But in the specific instance where you know who the person is, you have a name, you have a roundabout date of birth, the quickest way that I've seen people do it is through a process called a skip trace. And that's where it's basically the same thing that credit card companies use or creditors use. There are special agencies that specialize in a skip trace, and they literally find the person's social security number and run their credit record. And that is the most surefire way to find it when you actually know the name and sort of kind of around date that this person was born. So that's just to explain how complicated the actual title search could be before we even get to running a succession. So this whole process can take weeks or months. So obviously that's not good for a person in a disaster scenario. Can I have the next slide, please? So what FEMA realized was it was impractical to have folks who are going through a disaster go through all these steps, through all these expenses to receive disaster funds. So the new thing is the idea of self-certification rather than this need of formal documentation. And with the self-certification, it's basically an affidavit that the disaster, that the person going through the disaster can actually fill out and attest to certain things. And even with this, it's still very difficult because, like I said, in a matter where it's heirs property that you inherited from your parents or your grandparents, you know when they died, you know who they are. But there are instances of heirs property owners where it could be 5 or 6 generations removed between the disaster applicant and the registered owner. So even with this, there's still a gap. There's still a hole. Like there's an instance where you know of your great-great-great-grandfather, Jamie Reynolds. You know of this person. You don't know which decade they died. You don't know if you can get a death certificate. In a lot of states, to get a death certificate, you have to be able to prove that you're related to this person. You have to be able to prove that you're in this lineage. So there's still a gap between this new rule and where we were and where we need to go. Now, how to fulfill this, obviously the reason why FEMA needs some sort of proof of ownership is to relinquish fraud, is to prevent fraud. But there's still a gap between preventing fraud and having rightful owners have access to disaster recovery funds. Next slide, please. So one of the main things that Louisiana Appleseed that we're doing to alleviate this is we're trying to educate legislators and policymakers on informing them of this problem and of this gap. And we're trying to push through different laws and changes to fulfill this. The secondary thing is we're training government agencies, lawyers, other nonprofits, and community leaders how to identify this problem and how to mitigate this problem. And then the biggest thing is we're directly in contact with homeowners, and we're trying to get them to move away from this unstable form of homeownership, which is heirs property, to a more stable form of homeownership where when a disaster does happen, they won't have to jump through as many hoops. We're trying to do the work on the front end, but also for those people who are currently suffering from the disaster, looking for funds to rebuild, we're actually helping them fix their title and going through the successions and getting the proper paperwork that FEMA needs. So I think I answered the biggest questions as far as how do you find an heir who, if you know who the heir is, you know their name, you know around when they were born, you can do that through a skip trace. You have to find one of those agencies. And what was the secondary question? Ida and Katrina. I'm gonna be honest, a lot of the Ida stuff is still coming through. Like we're still dealing with it right now in Louisiana. And it's still arduous to prove ownership, even with the new rules, depending on how far removed the heir is from the record owner.
Great, yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Jonathan. As you know, Ida was a really big disaster, and I'm sure that it's still taking some time for those recovery programs to roll out. And that was great, Jonathan. Thanks for providing that context. And I want to turn it over now to Amanda. And Amanda, to build on Stephanie and Jonathan's remarks, I'd love if you can share more about how FEMA is incorporating this type of feedback that you've heard over the years and just now. How are you incorporating that feedback into your programs and responses moving forward? And I also know that you'll provide an overview of FEMA's focus on equity. And if you can incorporate a few questions that we received as well, that would be great. A few of those questions were, how will FEMA measure performance and outcomes under this new strategic plan? Is there anything that FEMA learned from the implementation of the prior strategic plan from 2018 to 2022 to inform the new plan? And how will FEMA plan to ensure that the changes that you've recently announced are implemented in a uniform way across all disaster areas?
Great, thanks a lot. And thanks for Stephanie and John for kind of prefacing all of this with their presentations, because it all comes down to the disaster survivor. And with FEMA, our programs are obviously limited based on regulations and statutes that are in place. So I love seeing how these individual groups are addressing some of these issues, especially John's group with the affidavits of heirship. Like you mentioned before, we've implemented a lot of changes to make the process smoother, and like he mentioned, it's all about how do we prevent fraud and still get money into the rightful hands. You know, it's a challenge. So I'll have Tracy, if you can hit the next slide, please. I'll go ahead and get started here with the fun stuff. So I'm with FEMA's Individuals and Households Program, the Regulations and Policy team. So I'll focus on addressing recent changes made to policy and procedure as a result of the renewed focus on improving equitable delivery of FEMA disaster assistance. So while FEMA routinely updates and clarifies our policy based on improvements identified through lessons learned, through recent disaster activity, as well as historic disasters, we also look at comments received during the agency's request for information. We ask for input from the public regarding FEMA programs, regulations, and collections of information. But this renewed focus on equity is a result of the President's Day 1 executive order that Jeannie and Stephanie mentioned before, the Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the federal government. So that's what brought about this renewed focus on equity through FEMA's strategic plan that has been linked in the chat for everyone to view. You'll see a lot of our strategic plans focus on equity, focus on simplifying the process of delivering disaster assistance. So that's obviously the main focus for FEMA during this 4-year period right now. We want to hone in on how we can improve the program even further. So, excuse me, today I want to focus on the improvements made as a result of that executive order that we've made to our policy that will assist disaster survivors with proving ownership and or occupancy. So if we can go to the next slide. Here we go, we'll start with the home ownership part. So ownership and occupancy are vital prerequisites for receiving many forms of disaster assistance. The changes that we have in place that we'll speak about in a moment are effective for disasters declared on or after August 23rd of 2021. So in reviewing the, oh, I've lost my thing, there we go. So in reviewing the information shown on this slide here, it shows our challenges with home ownership. So as Jonathan spoke to, the heirship, the inheritance of a property throws a lot of wrenches in the system for many disaster survivors, because if you inherited a property from your great-grandfather or your great-grandmother and none of that paperwork is anywhere nearby, it could be a homestead situation where taxes may not be coming to you. There's a whole myriad of issues that we try to overcome while still trying to weed out any possibility for fraud, because we know there are fraudsters out there, and we want to make sure to protect our applicants as well as the general public from this kind of skewing the system to benefit anyone with ill means. So we've excuse me, if you go on to the next slide, Tracy. So like I mentioned before, back in August, we expanded some of the options for verifying homeownership and occupancy. And next slide. So here's the fun part. This shows how we did business before. And as they reference the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, the IAPPG, we updated it last May. And so these original options for verifying homeownership, they've been in place for many years. They're not set in stone. So FEMA's always flexible with working with the applicant and working with the state or the field offices, if applicable, to try to verify the ownership. And, not everybody's situation fits into a little box. It's not everybody's going to have a mobile home manufactured home certificate or title. It's not realistic in most places, but we want to capture a lot of issues that are out there. We want to expand them, but again, we are flexible. So if you're working with an applicant out in the field or through your group, if there's a unique situation that doesn't fit into one of these boxes, send it on to us. Have the applicant appeal, have the applicant provide what they have. Because if it's not listed here, that doesn't mean it's excluded. So keep that in mind. So if you look over on the right-hand column, the expanded options, it used to be that we would only accept documentation proving ownership within a limited amount of time. And we've now expanded that to a year prior to the disaster or within the 18-month period of assistance. And that 18-month period of assistance is standard for all disasters. So 18 months after the disaster is declared, by the president. That's a big deal because it used to just be several months or within a year or a very limited time frame. So this is a big step. We've also included receipts for major repairs or maintenance within the last 5 years prior to the disaster. So if an applicant is claiming they have ownership rights to the house, maybe it's a lease to own agreement with the landowner. If the applicant can show that they replace the roof or replace the water heater, a major repair that is generally restricted to a person who truly has ownership intent of the home, we will accept that. We've also included letter from a mobile home park owner or manager to confirm that someone owned a mobile home that's residing in the park. We've got public official statements, which could be postmaster, the applicant's receiving mail there, law enforcement, any sort of local county official verifying the ownership of the property. We've got court documents and John's favorite topic, affidavit of heirship. So we've expanded all of these to try to make the process a little simpler. So we can go to the next slide, please, Tracy. And along those lines, verifying occupancy is equally important and may affect even more disaster survivors than proving ownership, because you cannot receive temporary housing assistance, personal property assistance, many forms of assistance through FEMA's programs without proving that you lived at the house at the time of the disaster. Of course, we provide transportation, medical, dental, things that don't require proof that you lived at the house at the time of the disaster. So when verifying occupancy, we just want something to say, you live there. You're not just giving information about a property you rented 10 years ago, to try to circumvent the system. So again, keeping in mind that we're stewards of the taxpayer dollars, we want to protect people from fraud, but we also want to expand this and make it equitable. So you'll see on the left-hand column are original options that have been in place, again, like ownership for many years. But similarly, the expanded options, we used to have a limitation of 3 months for documents to support occupancy, like 3 months prior to the disaster or right after the disaster. And now it's within a year. So you've got a voter registration card that you received, you've got a driver's license that was issued within a year. Any type of document that shows you were associated to that address a year prior to the disaster and up to a year and a half after the disaster. We've also incorporated the eligibility for social service organization letters from the school district, federal or state benefit letters, and vehicle registrations, affidavit of residency, court documents, and a mobile home park statement. So the big thing that is going to make a large impact on disaster survivors in the future is sometimes the affidavit of residency, the court documents, because if you think about an applicant who lives in a home, maybe their rental situation is unique. Maybe there's not a lease agreement, the situation is unique. We all know there's unique situations out there. Their kids go to a school within the district. Obviously, schools keep track of the address that the kid's associated to. So to open that up, logically, we'll accept a letter from the school saying this is the address that we have associated to this child. This is their guardian, and that works. It's something that places the applicant at the house during the time frame of the disaster. Also important about court documents. if we have a subpoena or a summons or anything, you know, all else fails. If there's something from the court system saying this person was served at this address, you know, anything. And like I said before with the ownership, this isn't a one size fits all situation. We're trying to list out very common situations and common ways to overcome those issues. So if you're working with an applicant or disaster survivor who has a unique situation, encourage them or your staff to send in whatever they have, because our job is to make it easier on the applicant and, like mentioned before, prevent fraud. So anything that can legitimately link them to the house, that's what we want to accept. That's what we want to work with. So I encourage you to do that. And if Tracy, if you could hit the next slide. And I believe I overspoke. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, is that the end of my slides? What I'll do is let me go over some of the, this can't be that easy. Let me go over some of the questions that were submitted. All right. So we have one of the questions received from the attendees. Have you seen any changes recently in disaster survivors receiving assistance after these changes were implemented? So I do actually have some numbers. We all like numbers and percentages. So since August of last year, we've had a fairly busy disaster season, for lack of a better term, in that there were a lot of large events, tornadoes, fires, flooding, where we got to put this updated policy to good use. So we saw that for ownership, the automated ownership process that we use for disasters is averaging around 76% verification, which means we've got public records linking the applicant to the home as the owner. So with the updated expanded policy, our FEMA inspectors were able to pass, again, for lack of a better term, to verify the ownership of 26% of those who failed the automated check. That means that over 41,000 applicants in the last several months received FEMA assistance for homeowners rather than having to receive a letter saying that we couldn't verify their ownership. It made such a huge difference that our inspectors were able to use the expanded eligibility items to verify their ownership. So we have applicants now that get the letter saying, you know, we're unable to verify your ownership, submit this. So our letters now incorporate these additional items to give them options to submit. As far as the self-certification part of our updated, our updated policy, we've had 165 additional applicants who used a self-certification process. You know, it's a method of last resort. If you have no official, you know, documentation or paperwork, we now accept this self-certification. And, you know, in the last few months, it's helped 165 applicants with that specific issue. And then when it comes to the expanded occupancy documents, our current occupancy verification rate is about 90% for disasters. So since the implementation of these expanded occupancy verification items, we've assisted over 52,000 disaster survivors in receiving assistance without having to receive the letter. We always say the letter. You know, the letter is great. It notifies them. It gives them a really specific plain language list of what to submit to FEMA just to verify their occupancy. But with this new expanded process, our inspectors and damage assessors are able to view that information and assist people more quickly. And additionally, we had 82 applicants that use the occupancy self-certification option to help them verify their occupancy as a last resort. And so if I have just a couple more minutes, there are a couple more questions. One very specific to your group. How will FEMA improve attorneys' ability to speak with FEMA on behalf of their clients? This is a very common question that we get. So as you know, the Privacy Act requires that we limit obvious access to a disaster survivor's file. There's a lot of personally identifiable information contained therein. So we do follow the Privacy Act regulations surrounding that, but we do allow for you to submit a written consent, but we allow for the applicant to. So you can work with the applicants, the disaster survivors, to provide a written consent, giving third-party access to their disaster assistance records. You may also have the applicant with you if you're in a situation where there's an applicant sitting in front of you. They may call FEMA, go through the system, we verify their identity, and they can give the phone over to you. They can authorize us verbally to speak to you on their behalf while they're sitting in front of you. Of course, it's easier to get a written consent. We'll have it on file, and it needs to name the person or group. If you have a specific group like the Louisiana Appleseed group, they can name an entire group or a specific attorney to view their disaster records. And I believe the last question I have on my list here is options for undocumented families. So I want to remind you that while FEMA assistance is generally limited to US citizens, there are many different forms of disaster assistance that are funded by FEMA, including crisis counseling, emergency sheltering, disaster case management. So keep in mind that while financial assistance is limited to US citizens, we don't just leave someone, outside of a shelter, based on their citizenship status. We don't deny crisis counseling based on citizenship status. So keep that in mind. On the other hand, if you have an undocumented family, for example, and they have a minor child that is a US citizen, whether the child is 3 months old or 13 years old, they can apply for FEMA assistance on behalf of that minor child who is a US citizen and be provided temporary housing assistance, personal property assistance, medical, dental assistance, anything that a US citizen would be eligible for otherwise. So keep that in mind if you're faced with a situation of assisting a family where the only US citizen in the household is a minor. That is an option available. So, and I will turn it back over to Jean and we'll address questions later. Thanks.
Great, thanks Amanda for providing the overview of the new changes in the strategic plan, and of course offering data since the changes took place and answering questions from our attendees. So we just want to take I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to cover a few questions or address a few questions that we also received about how attorneys can help in the aftermath of a disaster and what that looks like. So thanks, Tracy. So a few questions we received is, what is the best way, or what are the roles that pro bono attorneys and advocates can play in disaster legal services? Is there a document bank for documents such as FEMA appeals, and how can I sign up to help and get involved? We've listed here a few common ways that attorneys can help. I think I like to see it in 2 general broad categories. One is providing direct legal assistance to survivors, whether that's helping them with housing issues or FEMA appeals or SBA appeals. And then the other category is sort of supporting legal service organizations and other organizations on the ground with things like, educating survivors about their rights, training other attorneys on how to address common legal issues, and updating that information as things continue to evolve. If you go to the next slide, here are some other questions that we've encountered over the past few days. And also, I think these are questions that are common right after major disasters, especially the big ones. The American Bar Association has a disaster relief pro bono portal where we post pro bono opportunities across the country after a major disaster has happened. So we certainly encourage you, if you're an attorney or a coordinator, pro bono coordinator in your organization, to take a look at that portal and reach out to us if you have any questions. For smaller disasters, pro bono will not always be, there will not always be a need for pro bono attorneys, but certainly, it's something that if the local legal organization or the Bar Association has, it's something that we recommend checking locally and directly. And just to note that, like I said, not every disaster will have pro bono volunteer opportunities or mechanisms through which attorneys can provide pro bono. But it's certainly something that if you sign up to do, you should continue to monitor, as a lot of the needs may come in the months and years after the weather event has passed. If you could move to the next slide. And I know that we have a few questions, so I'll just go through this quickly. One note about the Katrina rule: for when disasters have been declared, only licensed attorneys in the state can provide legal services. However, there is one exception, which is the Katrina rule. It's modeled off an ABA court model rule that allows out-of-state attorneys to provide legal assistance to survivors in the state. However, this has to be under the supervision of the civil legal aid or pro bono program in order to provide the services during a declared emergency. And this is only for a temporary amount, which is determined by the state. Next slide. And then finally, we've included here a summary of lists that you can refer to. We've already mentioned the pro bono portal, the disaster attorney guidebook. There's also, if ABA Free Legal Answers is available in your state, that's another common way that attorneys can provide assistance. It's an online virtual sort of clinic where attorneys provide answers to questions that people may have about the disaster. We also have we also included the National Disaster Legal Aid Advocacy Center, which includes a bank. Someone asked about this, a brief bank, examples of FEMA appeals that attorneys have used in the past on behalf of their clients. So those are templates, which we encourage pro bono attorneys, legal services attorneys to take a look at in case that's helpful for your representation of the client. It requires a login, but membership is free. And we've also included the IPPG link there as well. All right, next slide. So do we have any questions, or Stephanie, Jonathan, anything else that you would want to add after Amanda's remarks? Okay.
I sent a question to you in the chat, Jeannie.
Oh, 1 second, okay. Okay, so I think maybe this is, Amanda, I know that you shared more about the assistance available to undocumented survivors. There's a question about where we can find more information for undocumented clients. And I know there are some, Linda, you mentioned there are some strategies in the National Disaster Guidebook as well, which is a good resource to refer to for that question.
Right, yeah, the National Disaster Guidebook that you referenced, that's ideal. Also, any state or local partners, we set up disaster recovery centers in catastrophic events. There'll be resources there. If there's no one in the family that is a U.S. citizen, unfortunately, our services with FEMA financial assistance are limited to someone in the household being a U.S. citizen. So definitely encourage them to visit one of the disaster recovery centers in the area and working with local state resources, even 211. A lot of times, a lot of the outreach groups with the local demographic, I'm trying to think of the name of some of the groups that reach out. It's escaping me right now, but a lot of the resource groups will offer assistance. They'll offer different federal programs, different state programs, and local ones that they'll send to 211. So a lot of times we do refer people to contact 211 with those kind of specific things outside the scope of FEMA assistance.
Yeah, one thing we learned, so I'm based in New York, and we were affected by Hurricane Ida last year. And I know that the VOADs and COADs and the volunteer organizations active in disaster were a great group that had information about other services available to disaster survivors, including undocumented survivors. So like Amanda was saying, reaching out to your community and local groups that are responding to the disaster is a good way. And I know that also states publish information and other relief available through their own sites as well. All right, well, I think we're at time. I want to share a reminder with everyone that you can find the slides in the replay page, which the ABA will upload along with the recording. And next slide. Here's our contact information if you would like to reach out with any questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, ideas. We welcome them. And lastly, I want to thank Stephanie, Jonathan, and Amanda so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.